There is a very specific kind of physical exhaustion that men our age have convinced themselves is just a normal part of getting older. It usually hits right around 2 or 3 in the afternoon. You feel a sudden heavy drop in your energy. Your legs feel like they are made of lead. The space behind your eyes feels tight. Your concentration shatters into a million pieces, and you find yourself staring at a computer screen or out a window, feeling like your brain is trying to wade through thick mud. For years, I assumed that feeling was just the cost of doing business in your 50s. I thought it was the natural accumulation of decades of hard work, stress, and gravity finally calling in the debts. I would push through it. I would pour another cup of coffee, grit my teeth, and force my body to keep moving until the day was over. But the real problem was not what happened at 3 in the afternoon. The real problem was what happened at 10 o'clock at night. Because when a man spends his entire day carrying that kind of heavy, sluggish physical depletion, it does not magically vanish when the bedroom door closes. You cannot spend 12 hours running your biological machinery completely into the ground and then expect it to suddenly spring to life, fully responsive and vital simply because you want it to. I remember the profound frustration of lying in bed next to the woman I was married to at the time, wanting to feel connected, wanting to experience that physical closeness, and realizing with a cold knot of panic in my stomach that the equipment simply was not going to cooperate. The signal was being sent from my brain, but the machinery was completely dead in the water. There is nothing quite as isolating as that moment. You feel a sudden, sharp disconnect between who you think you are as a man and what your body is actually capable of doing. When it happens once, you blame it on being tired. When it happens twice, you start getting nervous. When it becomes a predictable pattern, you start building walls. You stop initiating. You roll over and pretend you are asleep. You create a quiet, heavy distance in your relationship, not because you do not care, but because the shame of a physical failure is too much to confront out loud. We look for incredibly complicated reasons for this decline. When a man in his 50s or 60s starts losing his physical response, his mind immediately jumps to the worst-case scenarios. We think our vascular system is permanently ruined. We think our hormones have permanently flatlined. We start looking up expensive medical treatments, complicated pharmaceutical solutions, and aggressive interventions. We assume that a massive failure requires a massive, complex fix. I did all of that. I spent hours reading about hormone replacement, about arterial plaque, about aging and physical decline. I was convinced that my life as a fully capable, vital man was simply over. It took me a long time to realize that I was looking right past the absolute baseline of human biology. I was ignoring the most fundamental requirement of my physical infrastructure, simply because it seemed too basic, too simple, and too ordinary to possibly be the cause of such a massive problem. I was literally starving my body of water. I was walking around in a state of severe chronic dehydration for the better part of a decade, and I was completely blind to it. I spent most of my career as a sales executive. In that world, your entire existence is built around movement, pressure, and caffeine. I would go to 3-day industry conferences in places like Las Vegas. I would spend 72 hours walking across miles of carpeted convention center floors in aggressively air-conditioned, bone-dry environments. My routine was identical every single day. I would wake up exhausted, drink 2 massive cups of black coffee just to get my eyes open, and head down to the floor. I would talk to people nonstop for 10 hours. At lunch, I might have a diet soda. In the evening, I would sit at a hotel bar with clients, drinking bourbon to wind down from the adrenaline of the day. I was constantly putting liquids into my body, but I was not actually hydrating. I was living on a steady diet of diuretics, chemicals that actively forced moisture out of my system, while demanding that my body operate at peak performance. I remember coming home to Scottsdale after one of those long trips in my early 50s. I was physically destroyed. I remember trying to be intimate that night, hoping that the comfort of being home would somehow reset the system. It was a complete humiliating failure. The machinery simply refused to respond. I sat in the living room alone at 2 in the morning, feeling incredibly old and incredibly defeated, entirely unaware that I had spent the last 3 days systematically thickening my own blood to the consistency of motor oil. We forget that the male physical response is not magic. It is not purely an emotional event. It is a strictly mechanical hydraulic process. For an erection to occur, a very specific sequence of physical events has to happen perfectly. The brain sends a signal, the smooth muscle tissue in the pelvic region relaxes, and a massive volume of blood has to rush into a very concentrated network of fragile, delicate blood vessels. That blood has to move quickly, and it has to move with enough pressure to create absolute firmness. If you do not have adequate blood flow, the hydraulic system fails. It does not matter how much you want it to work. The mechanics simply will not allow it. And the simple, undeniable fact that I'd completely ignored is that human blood is composed almost entirely of water. When you fail to put adequate pure hydration into your system, your blood physically changes its composition. It loses its fluidity. It becomes viscous. It becomes thick and sluggish. Imagine trying to push cold syrup through a narrow plastic straw. You have to squeeze incredibly hard, you have to apply a massive amount of pressure, and even then, the fluid barely moves. Now imagine trying to push warm water through that same straw. It flows effortlessly, instantly filling the space. When I was living on coffee, stress, and airplane air, my blood was that thick syrup. My heart was working overtime just to push that sluggish fluid through the major arteries of my body to keep me conscious. By the time that blood reached the incredibly narrow, sensitive vascular networks of the reproductive system, there simply was not enough velocity or volume left to create any kind of physical response. I was trying to execute a hydraulic function with a completely empty tank. But the mechanical failure of thick blood is only the first part of the disaster. The second part is what a lack of water does to your hormonal baseline. And this was the discovery that completely shifted how I view my own daily habits. The human body is an incredibly intelligent survival machine. It does not care about your ego. It does not care about your sex life. It only cares about keeping your vital organs functioning for another 24 hours. When you live in a state of chronic dehydration, your brain eventually realizes that it is facing a severe shortage of a critical resource. It registers the lack of water not as an inconvenience, but as a literal famine. When a biological system senses a famine, it goes into a state of triage. It immediately begins shutting off power to any system that is not strictly necessary for immediate survival. It pulls moisture away from your skin. It pulls fluid away from your joints, which is why your knees and lower back start aching for no apparent reason. And the very first major system that the brain shuts down during a crisis is the reproductive system. Your body looks at the biological ledger, sees that it barely has enough fluid to keep your liver and your brain functioning, and decides that physical intimacy is an absolute luxury it can no longer afford. It executes this shutdown through your hormones. When the brain panics about a lack of water, it floods your system with cortisol. Cortisol is the chemical alarm bell. It is the stress hormone that prepares you to fight or run for your life. When your cortisol levels spike, your testosterone levels inevitably crash. The body uses the exact same raw chemical materials to produce both hormones, and it will always prioritize the stress hormone when it feels threatened. I was convinced that my lack of drive, my disappearing libido, and my physical failures were permanent signs of aging. I had no idea that I was actively putting my own body into a state of severe physiological panic every single day. I was chemically crushing my own testosterone simply by refusing to drink a glass of water. The realization hit me slowly, over the course of a few months, after I finally decided to stop feeling sorry for myself and start taking responsibility for my own infrastructure. I started paying attention to the guys around me who actually seemed to have vitality in their later years. I noticed that the guys who still had energy, the guys who still looked physically capable, were not the ones carrying around massive coffees all day. They were the ones who were constantly, quietly sipping water. I decided to run an experiment on myself. I decided to treat hydration not as an afterthought, but as the most important mechanical maintenance of my day. But as I started looking into how the body actually processes fluid, I realized that I had to change more than just the volume of what I was drinking. I had to change the exact mechanics of how I drank it. Because an aging digestive system does not process resources the same way a 20-year-old system does. I had spent my whole life treating drinking water like an annoying chore. When I felt thirsty, I would grab the biggest, coldest glass of water I could find, chug it in 10 seconds flat, and get back to whatever I was doing. I learned very quickly that this was the absolute worst possible way to hydrate a body that is already struggling. The first major rule I had to implement was abandoning ice-cold water entirely. In America, we have this strange obsession with everything being served at near-freezing temperatures. We think that if a drink does not have condensation dripping down the glass, It is not refreshing. But from a biological standpoint, dumping 30 ounces of ice water into an empty stomach is an act of sheer violence against your internal organs. Your core temperature is 98 degrees. When you throw freezing fluid into that environment, the stomach immediately recoils. The blood vessels in the digestive tract violently constrict in shock. The body has to immediately halt the digestion of any food, stop the absorption of any nutrients, and divert a massive amount of internal energy to act as a furnace, warming that water up before it can safely pass into the intestines. It creates a massive, unnecessary burden on a system that needs all its energy to repair your tissues and produce hormones. I switched entirely to room temperature water. It felt incredibly unsatisfying for the first few days. I missed the sharp, aggressive shock of the cold. But almost immediately, I noticed that the heavy, uncomfortable bloating I used to feel after drinking water completely vanished. The fluid felt gentle. It felt like it was being welcomed by my system rather than treated as an invading threat. The second rule was changing the speed. I had to stop the flash flooding. Think about a completely dried out, stiff sponge sitting on a kitchen counter. If you take a large cup of water and dump it directly onto that sponge all at once, the water does not absorb. It splashes off the rigid surface and runs entirely over the counter. But if you take that same cup of water and pour it in a slow, steady, careful trickle, the sponge slowly softens, opens up, and absorbs every single drop. Your gastrointestinal tract operates on the exact same principle. When you chug a massive amount of water because you suddenly realize you are thirsty, you overwhelm the absorption capacity of your intestines. The body cannot process that much volume in that short of a window. It triggers an immediate diuretic response, sending the water straight to your bladder to be flushed out. You think you are hydrating your blood, but you are really just creating an emergency exit for the fluid. I bought a heavy glass bottle and started keeping it with me everywhere. I trained myself to take small, consistent sips every 15 minutes. I maintained a steady, slow trickle of moisture into the sponge. It gave my digestive system the time it actually needed to pull the water through the intestinal walls and deliver it directly into the bloodstream, slowly and steadily thinning out the oil in the engine. The third rule I adopted felt strange at first, but it fundamentally changed how my nervous system responded to hydration. I started paying attention to my physical posture when I drank. I spent my corporate years drinking water while pacing back and forth on stressful phone calls, or while walking rapidly through airport terminals. I was always in motion. When you are walking, or when you are standing up and feeling stressed, your autonomic nervous system is in a state of sympathetic activation. You are in a mild state of fight or flight. Your brain is directing blood flow away from your digestive core and pushing it out toward your arms and legs, assuming you need to move to survive. If you try to put fluid into your body while you are in fight or flight mode, the digestive organs simply do not have the blood supply necessary to absorb it efficiently. The system is shut down for emergency purposes. I made a quiet commitment to myself. Unless it is an absolute emergency, I do not drink water standing up. When I take a drink, I find a chair. I sit down. I let the tension drop out of my shoulders. I let my legs relax. By physically lowering your body into a seated position, you send a mechanical signal to your brain that you are no longer in danger. You manually shift the nervous system from fight or flight into the parasympathetic state, the state of rest and digest. The blood vessels in your core physically dilate. The digestive tract receives a rush of warm blood. And the water you sip is processed with maximum efficiency, moving directly into the circulatory system where it can actually support the pelvic region. It is a minor behavioral shift, but it honors the reality of how an aging nervous system actually functions. The final piece of the puzzle was understanding the timeline. When I first realized how dehydrated I was, my instinct was to try and catch up at the end of the day. I would drink 2 huge glasses of water right after dinner, or keep a massive bottle on the nightstand and drink from it right before turning out the lights. I was destroying the one thing my body needed more than anything else to rebuild its hormonal baseline. I was destroying my sleep. I was waking up 3 or 4 times every single night to walk to the bathroom. I thought it was just an inevitable prostate issue. I did not realize I was doing it to myself. Your body produces the vast majority of its testosterone during the deepest phases of your sleep cycle. It requires long, uninterrupted blocks of rest to manufacture the hormones that give you physical confidence and drive. Every time you wake up because your bladder is full, you shatter that sleep architecture. You cut off the factory floor right in the middle of production. I learned to aggressively front load my hydration. I drink almost all the water my body needs between the moment I wake up and roughly 4 in the afternoon. When dinner comes around, I will have a small glass and I sip it slowly. By 8 o'clock at night, the intake stops entirely. This gives my kidneys the time they need to process the fluid and clear the bladder long before my head hits the pillow. It protects the sleep cycle. It allows the body to go dark, stay dark, and do the quiet, invisible work of rebuilding the hormonal reserves that I rely on the next day. None of these changes cost money. They did not require a doctor to write a prescription. They did not require a massive overhaul of my entire life. They simply required me to drop the arrogance of assuming my body would just magically handle whatever I threw at it. They required me to look at my own biology with a little bit of respect and to recognize that a machine with some miles on it requires a much more intentional level of maintenance. It took a few months of consistency to see the real changes. You cannot reverse a decade of severe cellular dehydration in a weekend. But the shifts did happen, and they were profound. The heavy, muddy fatigue that used to crush me at 3 in the afternoon slowly lifted. My joints stopped aching when I got out of bed. But the most important change was the one I felt in the absolute quiet of my own home. As my blood volume stabilized, as the viscosity of my blood thinned out and returned to normal, and as my body realized it was no longer in a state of severe drought, the cortisol alarms finally shut off. The biological panic ended, and slowly the hydraulic pressure returned. The physical firmness, the predictability, the response that I thought I had lost forever to the aging process gradually began to reassert itself. I did not need a pill. I did not need a medical intervention. I just needed to put the correct fluid in the tank in the correct way so the pump could actually do its job. I am married to Alyssa now. She is a woman who appreciates honesty and presence above almost everything else. When I am with her, I do not feel that heavy, cold knot of panic in my stomach anymore. I feel connected. I feel capable. I feel like a man who actually owns his own body again. And that confidence did not come from a magic trick. It came from understanding the plumbing. A lot of men our age are walking around feeling completely defeated by their own biology. They look in the mirror and think the best parts of their physical lives are gone. They carry a quiet, heavy shame into their relationships, and they suffer in total silence, convinced that they are broken beyond repair. But you might not be broken at all. You might just be dried out. You have the power to change the actual thickness of your blood by tomorrow morning. You have the ability to lower the stress hormones flooding your system just by changing how you manage a glass of water. You can restore the hydraulic capacity of your own body quietly and privately, starting right now. Stop treating your body like it is invincible. Stop shocking it with ice. Stop rushing the process. Sit down. Take a breath. Sip the water slowly. Let the sponge absorb it. Give your physical infrastructure the basic respect it is asking for. The machinery still works. You just have to learn how to maintain it.